When a wolf suddenly howled in the dead of night, its eerie cry echoed through the village, drawing the attention of the townsfolk. The howls were different this time, louder, more desperate. The villagers, already uneasy about the unmarked grave nearby, grew suspicious. Some believed the wolves were drawn to something buried there. Driven by fear and curiosity, they decided to exhume the grave. When they opened the casket, what they found inside sent waves of horror through them, and the wolf's cries seemed to signal that something far darker had been awakened. The village sat nestled between towering mountains, isolated from the world beyond. The air was thin and sharp, especially as winter tightened its grip, sending icy winds through the narrow streets and over the sloping roofs. The villagers, few and hardened by years of solitude, lived simple lives, their routines marked by the rise and fall of the sun, and the seasons that came and went with little notice. Yet tonight, something was different. The wolves were restless. From every corner of the village, the eerie howls echoed through the valley, rising and falling with a haunting rhythm. It wasn't the usual sound of a distant pack searching for food, but a low, drawn-out chorus that seemed to focus on one spot, a place the villagers knew all too well, the graveyard on the hill. The cemetery, old and neglected, stood on the edge of the village like a forgotten relic. The stones were cracked, and many of the graves had sunk into the earth, their inscriptions worn away by time. But there was one grave that the villagers had learned to avoid, an unmarked plot that had been the subject of whispers for decades. Some claimed it was cursed. Others said it held dark secrets, but no one had dared to disturb it until tonight. Henrik, the village council elder, stood near the window of the meeting hall, watching the darkness stretch across the hills, his face set in a grim expression. The howls grew louder, closer. He turned to the others sitting around the table, their faces drawn and tired.
Why are the wolves drawn to that spot?
He muttered, mostly to himself. Beside him, Jonas, a younger man who had always been skeptical of the village's old superstitions, shook his head.
It's just wolves, Henrik. They're hunting. We've lived with them for years.
A silence hung in the air. No one seemed convinced, especially after the wolves had begun their nightly rituals weeks ago. For some, the howls were a warning, something unnatural in the graveyard. No one dared go near it, and the stories about the place had only grown over the years. Sarah, an older woman who lived on the edge of the village, spoke up. Her voice trembled slightly, though whether from age or fear, it was hard to tell.
There's something wrong with that grave,
She said quietly.
I've always felt it. The wolves, they're trying to tell us something.
Jonas scoffed, rubbing his forehead.
It's just an animal's instinct. There's no curse, no mystery. This is nonsense.
But the others weren't so sure. Thomas, a middle-aged farmer with a heavy brow and a deep frown, spoke slowly, weighing each word.
I've seen them, the wolves. They don't act like this. They've been circling that grave for weeks. Something's not right.
Henrik, who had long since abandoned the village's old myths, couldn't ignore the unease that hung in the air. He had seen the wolves too, sometimes in the morning light, their eyes shining from the edge of the woods, never venturing too far into the village. But tonight, their presence was stronger, and their howls more persistent.
I think it's time we find out.
Henrik said, his voice firm despite the chill in the air.
We'll exhume the grave.
A murmur of surprise rippled through the group. The council had never agreed on anything so drastic before. The grave had always been left untouched, a shadow lingering at the edge of their lives, untouched by curiosity or need. But now, with the wolves howling like a chorus of warning, the tension among them was undeniable.
I don't see why we need to disturb the dead.
Thomas grumbled, his voice low. He wasn't a believer in the supernatural, but he wasn't eager to risk disturbing the uneasy peace that had long existed in the village.
We have to know.
Henrik replied, his eyes scanning the faces of the council members.
If the wolves are drawn to it, there's something we're missing. We need answers, and we need them now.
It wasn't a decision easily made, but Henrik's authority was respected, and soon the council had reluctantly agreed to the plan. By the time the moon rose higher in the sky, the villagers had gathered around the edge of the graveyard. The howling had ceased, as though the wolves themselves were waiting. The wind howled, carrying with it a sense of dread as the villagers prepared to dig. The unease in the air grew thicker, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. Whatever was buried here, whatever had drawn the wolves to it, was about to be unearthed. And with it, the secrets that had been buried for far too long would finally come to light. The villagers had gathered in the cemetery, a few huddled in groups, their breath forming clouds in the chilly morning. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a mix of dread and curiosity that hung over them like a heavy fog. The grave they had come to disturb sat at the far edge of the cemetery, surrounded by tall, wild grass. The headstone was long gone, leaving only a worn patch of earth. For years, no one had come near this grave, and no one had spoken of it, not directly anyway. The strange howls from the night before still echoed in the back of their minds, and they felt the wolves' presence as if they were being watched even now. Henrik stood at the front, his face solemn, his eyes fixed on the ground where they would dig. The villagers had no choice but to follow his lead. They had come to a decision, though not one they were all comfortable with. They had to know what lay beneath the earth. A few men stepped forward armed with shovels. There were no words spoken, just the scraping of metal against dirt, the sound of each scoop of earth being removed with a rhythmic persistence. The ground was hard and the digging took longer than they had expected. Every shovelful felt like an eternity, the earth stubborn and unmoving, as if it too resisted what was about to happen. As the first few layers of dirt were removed, a strange stillness seemed to fall over the group. The wind died down, and even the wolves' howling ceased. For a moment it was as if the world had stopped, holding its breath in anticipation. The deeper they dug, the more uncomfortable the villagers became. The silence between them grew, and each glance exchanged spoke volumes. Some were starting to question whether they were doing the right thing. Others were too caught up in the strange atmosphere to voice their discomfort. But Henrik remained calm, his focus unwavering. There was no turning back now. Finally, after what felt like hours, the shovel hit something solid. The men paused, exchanging uncertain looks. Henrik gave a nod, and they carefully cleared away the remaining earth. The outline of a wooden coffin began to emerge, its surface darkened with age. It was strange, almost too ordinary, standing in stark contrast to the mystery surrounding it. The villagers gathered around, their eyes wide, hearts racing in their chests. With careful hands, they began to lift the lid, their breaths shallow, barely making a sound. The air was thick with anticipation. When the lid finally creaked open, the sight that greeted them was like nothing they had expected. Inside the coffin lay the perfectly preserved body of a woman, her face peaceful, almost as if she were merely sleeping. Her skin was pale, almost unnaturally so, and her hair, dark and long, cascaded around her shoulders like it had never been touched by time. There was no decay, no signs of aging, only an eerie stillness that filled the air. But it wasn't just the woman's body that had been hidden for so long. Resting beside her, tucked carefully between her hands, was a bundle of letters, their edges yellowed and fragile. The sight of them sent a ripple of shock through the group. The letters were old, but they were intact, as though they had been sealed away, waiting for someone to find them. For a moment, no one moved. The villagers stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the scene before them. Henrik was the first to speak, his voice low and steady, though there was a tremor in it that he couldn't quite hide.
Who is she?
Tomas, the farmer whispered, his voice barely audible. His face was pale, his hands trembling.
I don't know,
Henrik replied, his voice heavy with uncertainty.
but we'll find out.
The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. No one knew what to say. The sight of the woman, untouched by time, was both beautiful and terrifying. The letters, though, were the real mystery. They had to be read, and they had to be understood. Some of the villagers began to murmur, their voices rising in confusion and fear.
We shouldn't have done this.
Sarah said, her voice tight.
This is wrong.
Leave it alone.
Jonas muttered, stepping back, shaking his head.
This is more trouble than we need.
But Henrik didn't waver. He stepped forward, carefully taking the bundle of letters from the woman's hands. He studied the fragile paper for a moment before tucking them into his coat.
We'll keep these safe for now,
he said, his tone final. As he did, a few of the villagers glanced at each other, their faces filled with worry. They could feel the weight of the moment, the heaviness of the discovery pressing down on them. What had they just uncovered? And why had the wolves been drawn here? To this place? To this grave? The body of the woman, still so lifelike in her repose, felt like a silent witness to the questions that would soon follow. The villagers knew they couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever had been buried here, whatever secrets had been locked away with her, would have to come to light.
Let's cover her back up.
Henrik said, his voice hardening with resolve.
But we're not finished, not yet.
There were no protests this time. The villagers knew the truth couldn't be hidden anymore. The grave, once a quiet corner of their village, had become a doorway to something far darker than they could have imagined. The wolves, the howling, there was a connection, one that was waiting to be uncovered. As they began to cover the coffin once more, the sound of the wolves' howls began to rise again in the distance, faint but unmistakable. The air grew colder, and the villagers felt it in their bones. The past was stirring, and the answers they sought were only beginning to unfold. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale light across the village as Henrik and a small group of villagers gathered around the table in the council hall. The bundle of letters was laid out before them, fragile and old, but each one a mystery in its own right. Rachel Brooks, the visiting journalist, had insisted on staying for the reading. She had been a quiet observer up until now, but her curiosity was too strong to resist. She sat at the table, notebook in hand, ready to record whatever came next. Henrik carefully unfolded the first letter, his hands trembling slightly as he did. The paper crinkled in protest, but it held the secrets it had carried for so long. The words written in neat script were simple but chilling.
To whoever reads this, know that I am guilty. I helped cover up the fire that destroyed the mill. It was meant to destroy the evidence, but it also destroyed the lives of those who depended on it. I didn't mean for it to go so far, but I was scared. The mayor said it was necessary. We had no choice. I am sorry. May God forgive me.
The room fell silent. The fire was a long-forgotten tragedy, the kind of event that had haunted the village for years. Some said it was an accident, others whispered of foul play. But now here it was, in plain black and white. The fire had been intentional, a cover-up for something bigger, and the mayor's name was tied to it. Rachel scribbled down notes, her eyes flicking between Henrik and the other villagers. They were all quiet, their faces a mix of shock and guilt. Henrik looked up, his voice low.
Do we know who this is?
That was Joanne.
Thomas, the farmer, said softly. His voice held a note of sadness.
She worked at the mill, but she was never seen after the fire. We thought she had run away.
Henrik nodded slowly and moved to the next letter. The words were scrawled hastily, as if the writer had been in a panic.
I couldn't stop it. They told me to do it. I had no choice. I've always been afraid. And they said it would be for the good of the village. The mayor said no one would suspect me. I did what I was told. I poisoned the well. I didn't know what it would do to them. I didn't mean to kill anyone.
A collective gasp rose from the group. The well poisoning had been the talk of the village for years, an unsolved mystery that had caused several deaths. Some had blamed tainted water, others had pointed fingers at illness, but no one had ever dared to suggest the truth.
Who would do such a thing?
Sarah whispered, her voice shaky.
That was years ago. I remember the sickness, but we never found out what caused it.
I remember.
Henrik said quietly.
I remember the fear. People were dropping dead, and no one knew why. But now we know. Someone did it on purpose.
He paused and glanced around the table.
And it was ordered by the mayor.
Rachel's pen scratched across her notebook, but she was careful not to interrupt. She could feel the tension building in the room, thickening the air like fog. The letters were revealing things no one had dared to speak of, and every letter seemed to tie back to the same name, the mayor. They continued reading.
I was young, too young to understand what they wanted me to do. But they promised me that if I helped, I would be free. They told me it was for the good of the village. I didn't think it would come to this. I thought they were only asking for a little bit of help, but I killed him. I still don't understand why, but I did it. I helped them bury the body.
The room went deathly still. The murder of Gregory, the town's blacksmith, had been a mystery for years. He had disappeared one night, and the villagers had been left to wonder what had happened. His death had been written off as an accident, but now the truth was out. The murder was part of something darker, and the mayor was involved.
Gregory,
Thomas muttered, his face pale.
I never thought it was anything more than a simple accident. But now I see.
Henrik closed the letter, his face a mask of frustration.
The mayor.
He repeated, his voice tight.
He's tied to all of these. He knew, he planned this, but who is he?
The group fell silent again, as if waiting for someone to answer. But no one had the answer. They had all heard the rumors about the mayor, the man who seemed to pull the strings in the village without ever showing his face. The older generation spoke of him in hushed tones, as if his name itself was cursed. Rachel spoke up for the first time, her voice calm but forceful.
This mayor, could he still be here? Could he still be alive?
Henrik shook his head slowly.
I don't know. But these letters tell us he was involved in everything, every crime. And it seems like everyone who's written in these letters was doing his bidding.
The group continued reading, each letter more shocking than the last. Some confessed to petty crimes, stealing, lying, but each one seemed to connect to the mayor in some way. A web of deceit and corruption had been spun, and now it was slowly unraveling before their eyes. As they finished the last letter, the room was heavy with silence. The weight of the truth had settled over them all. Some of the villagers looked shaken, others angry, but all of them were frightened. What could they do with this knowledge? How could they confront a figure who had remained hidden for so long? Rachel looked up from her notebook, her eyes bright with determination.
I will help. The world needs to know what happened here.
As the villagers left the room one by one, the air remained thick with tension. The letters had revealed a past they could no longer ignore, but the answers were still elusive. The mayor's true identity was still a mystery, and with it, the question of how deep his influence ran. The village, once quiet and isolated, was now on the brink of something far greater. The past had come to light, but the future remained uncertain. The mayor was still out there somewhere, and the villagers would have to face him, whether they were ready or not. Rachel spent the next few days immersed in the village's dusty archives. The council hall's old wooden shelves groaned under the weight of years of forgotten records. She sifted through books and papers, her fingers brushing against the aged pages as she searched for any scrap of information about the woman in the coffin. After searching thoroughly, she found that it was Alina. The village had always been quiet, its history more oral than written. But in those hidden corners of the archive, secrets had been left behind, waiting to be uncovered. Alina had come to the village years ago, a young teacher with a passion for educating the children of this remote place. Rachel found her name in several old registers and letters, but it was the journal entries that stood out. Alina had been determined, outspoken, everything that a village like this might fear. In one of Alina's journals, Rachel read about her early days in the village, her excitement and hope as she arrived, eager to make a difference. Alina had been an idealist, wanting to bring education to a place where many of the villagers were illiterate. She had a bright future ahead of her, or so it seemed.
The people are kind here, but they are also cautious. They live in fear, and they don't speak of certain things. I have heard whispers of the mayor, a figure who holds too much power. I intend to find out what is really going on. These people deserve better.
The words were clear, filled with a quiet strength. Alina had come to the village with good intentions, but she had quickly learned that the surface of the village was not what it appeared to be. Her idealism had led her to ask questions that no one else dared to ask. Rachel moved to another shelf, opening an old newspaper clippings box. There, in yellowed pages, she found articles detailing the mysterious disappearance of Alina. The reports were vague, almost dismissive, as if the village had tried to erase her from its memory. The headlines were cold. Missing teacher, search called off for Alina, and the most telling one, no leads in disappearance of village teacher. Her eyes lingered on a photograph of Alina, standing in front of the schoolhouse, smiling brightly. It was hard to imagine that this young woman had vanished without a trace, especially considering the way the villagers spoke of her. In an effort to find more answers, Rachel began interviewing the elderly residents who still lived in the village. Most of them were hesitant to speak, their eyes clouded with years of buried memories. But Rachel was persistent, and over time, a few of them began to open up. The first person she spoke with was Martha, an old woman who had once worked as a housekeeper for the local shopkeeper.
Alina,
Martha began, her voice trembling.
she was a good one. Too good for this place, I'd say. She started asking too many questions. The mayor didn't like that.
She paused, looking around nervously, as if the walls might have ears.
But that's not why they took her. She was too clever for them. She found out things that were better left unknown.
Martha's eyes flicked toward the window, as if to make sure no one was listening. Rachel pressed on, sensing the woman's fear.
What did she find out?
Rachel asked gently. Martha shook her head.
I don't know all the details, but Alina, she found out about the mayor's dealings, the corruption, the things he had been doing for years, things that hurt people. She was going to expose him, you see. She had a letter, a list of names, things she had uncovered. But, well, it wasn't safe for her. She knew too much.
Rachel's heart raced. The pieces were starting to fall into place. But she needed more. She needed to understand what happened to Alina after she had uncovered the truth. Martha looked down at her hands, her knuckles white with tension.
The night Alina disappeared, there was a strange silence in the village. Everyone went inside, locked their doors. No one saw her again.
Rachel nodded, her thoughts racing. It was clear now that Alina had been silenced, not just by the mayor, but by the village itself. The mayor's power wasn't just in his ability to control the people, it was in their fear of him. The silence surrounding Alina's death wasn't just a matter of ignorance, it was a matter of complicity. Rachel thanked Martha and left, her mind churning with the information she had just learned. But as she stepped into the cold air, the weight of the mystery seemed to press down on her even harder. She wasn't just investigating a story anymore. She was walking through the remnants of a tragedy that had been hidden for far too long. The next day, Rachel met with Henrik. She had gathered a lot of information, but there was still a missing piece. She needed answers, and she knew Henrik had some of them.
I've spoken with some of the elders.
Rachel began.
They say Alina found out about the mayor's corruption. She was going to expose him, but no one knows exactly what happened to her after that.
Henrik shifted uncomfortably in his seat.
The mayor. He's a ghost in this village. He's been here for as long as anyone can remember, but no one has ever seen him. Some say he's been dead for years, but his influence is still felt.
Rachel leaned forward.
But you know something, don't you? You've seen something, heard something. You know what happened to Alina.
Henrik was silent for a long moment. His gaze dropped to the table.
Alina was right. She uncovered things that no one was supposed to know. But the truth is, it wasn't just the mayor, the village, the people here. They all knew. They all stayed quiet because they were afraid.
Rachel's heart sank.
Afraid of what?
Henrik's voice dropped to a whisper.
Afraid of what would happen if they spoke out. Afraid of the consequences. Afraid of the mayor's power.
The words hung heavy in the air. Rachel could feel the weight of Henrik's guilt, the burden of the truth he had been carrying for so long. Rachel continued her search, digging deeper into the village's past, speaking with more villagers who had lived through the years when Alina was there. What she uncovered only deepened the mystery. Alina had been a woman ahead of her time, brave, outspoken, and willing to risk everything for the truth. She had uncovered not just the mayor's corruption, but a network of lies and betrayal that had held the village in its grip for decades. And when she had tried to expose it, the village had turned its back on her. The more Rachel uncovered, the more the villagers seemed to close in on themselves. They whispered in the streets, casting wary glances at each other. Paranoia began to spread. Who had been involved? Who had helped silence Alina? And who among them still carried the weight of that silence? As Rachel pieced together the details of Alina's life, it became clear that she had been a woman of exceptional courage. She had tried to expose the corruption, but she had been betrayed by the very people she had come to help. And now the village was paying the price for its complicity. The darkness that had been buried for so long was beginning to resurface, and no one was sure who would be caught in its wake. Rachel and Henrik sat in the dimly lit council room, the final pieces of the puzzle spread out before them. The tension in the air was palpable. They had spent days, even weeks, sifting through old records, talking to the villagers, piecing together a story that had been buried for far too long. But now they were close. The truth was within their grasp. The final proof came in the form of a small, hidden ledger they had found in the old archives. It was a simple book, the pages worn and yellowed with age, but the words inside were damning. The ledger detailed transactions, notes, and blackmail schemes, all orchestrated by the mayor. He had used his power to manipulate the villagers, controlling them through fear and threats. Some had been forced to commit crimes, others had been silenced, all under the threat of exposure or ruin. Rachel stared at the ledger in disbelief. It was clear now that the mayor's control over the village wasn't just based on fear. It was a calculated effort to keep everyone in line. He had used their weaknesses, their secrets against them, and in doing so, had kept the entire village under his thumb for decades. Henrik sat beside her, his face grim.
This is it. This is the proof we needed. He wasn't just a figurehead. He was the mastermind behind everything, the fire, the poisoning, the murders. He controlled it all.
Rachel nodded slowly.
But how did he keep it all a secret for so long? How did no one speak out?
Henrik sighed.
Fear. He made sure everyone had something to hide, something they were ashamed of. That's how he kept them quiet.
As they continued to go through the records, they heard a soft knock on the door. When Henrik opened it, a young man stepped inside. He was tall, his face drawn with a mixture of guilt and determination.
I need to speak with you.
The man said, his voice shaky.
I'm Robert, the great-grandson of the mayor.
Rachel's heart skipped a beat. The mayor's bloodline? This was unexpected. Robert closed the door behind him and stepped further into the room, his eyes darting between Henrik and Rachel.
I've been carrying this for years,
Robert began, his voice faltering.
My family knew what happened to Alina. We knew she was killed because she uncovered the truth. But we buried it. We buried it out of shame. My great-grandfather was a monster, and we didn't want the world to know. We tried to protect the family name.
Rachel's eyes widened in shock.
You're telling me your family covered up her murder?
Robert nodded, his hands clenched into fists at his sides.
Yes, I hate what he did, and I hate that my family chose to protect him. But I can't live with it anymore. I know the truth needs to come out.
Henrik looked at Robert, his expression a mixture of disbelief and understanding.
Why are you telling us this now, after all this time?
Because it's time,
Robert said, his voice steadying.
I've spent my life trying to forget, trying to bury the shame. But the letters, they made me realize that keeping the truth hidden only makes it worse. My great-grandfather was a coward, and so were we. But I can't be part of that anymore.
Rachel felt a wave of relief wash over her. For so long, the village had been in the dark about the mayor's true role in the events that had unfolded. But now the truth was finally coming to light, piece by piece.
The letters,
Robert continued, his voice quieter now.
They were written by the people who knew what happened. They all felt guilty for not speaking up sooner. They knew the mayor was behind it all, but they were afraid. They hoped in some small way that someone would find those letters, that someone would uncover the truth and finally expose him.
Henrik and Rachel exchanged a glance. The letters had always seemed like a cry for help, a way for the villagers to atone for their silence. But now it was clear. Those letters were more than just confessions. They were a collective act of guilt, a desperate hope that the truth would one day emerge. Robert looked at Rachel and Henrik, his eyes filled with regret.
I'm sorry, I wish I could have done more sooner. But maybe now, maybe this can bring some justice to Alina. and to everyone else he hurt.
Rachel stood up, her mind racing with the enormity of the revelations.
The truth is out now,
She said, her voice firm.
and it's time the village faced it.
Henrik nodded.
We can't undo the past, but we can make sure it never happens again. The mayor's reign of terror is over.
As Robert left the room, Rachel felt the weight of the past lifting ever so slightly. The village's dark history was no longer just a story. It was a reality that had to be reckoned with. The letters had been the key, and now the truth was laid bare for everyone to see. It had taken years, but finally, justice was within reach. The silence that had once enveloped the village was starting to break, and in its place, a new beginning was taking shape. The letters had served their purpose. They had been a final plea, a collective confession, and now they were the catalyst for change. The truth had been revealed, and there would be no going back. The sun had set, casting long shadows over the village as the townsfolk gathered in the community hall. The room was filled with murmurs and restless glances, but the presence of Henrik and Rachel at the front of the room silenced the crowd. They stood together, the weight of the truth they were about to reveal pressing heavily on their shoulders. Henrik cleared his throat, his voice strong but filled with emotion.
This village has lived in the shadow of fear for far too long. Fear of what the mayor could do, fear of the truth we have all tried to bury. But it's time for that fear to end.
Rachel stepped forward, holding up the ledger and a stack of the letters.
We've uncovered the truth.
She said, her voice steady.
The mayor, your leader, was not the protector you believed him to be. He was the architect of corruption, blackmailing and manipulating this entire community. Alina, the teacher you all failed to protect, knew the truth and paid with her life.
A collective gasp echoed through the room as the villagers absorbed the weight of her words. Some looked away, unable to meet the truth head-on. Others sat in stunned silence, their faces unreadable. Henrik took a deep breath before continuing.
Alina didn't deserve what happened to her, but her courage in seeking justice is something we cannot forget. And now, we have a choice. We can continue to hide from our past, or we can confront it. We can choose to move forward together.
The room was still for a long moment, the only sound the quiet rustling of paper as Rachel laid the letters on the table. It was as if the entire village was holding its breath, unsure of what would come next. Finally, one of the older men, a farmer named Thomas, stood up. His voice cracked as he spoke.
I remember Alina. She was good. She wanted to help us, and we let her down. We let all of you down.
His eyes flickered to Henrik and Rachel.
You've uncovered things we should have known long ago, but we were scared. Scared of the mayor. Scared of what he could do.
Henrik nodded solemnly.
I understand. But fear has kept us trapped for too long. It's time we stop letting fear guide us and start living with honesty.
A young woman who had been silent up until that point stood up.
I think we need to preserve the letters. They're proof of what we allowed to happen. But they're also a reminder of the price of silence. We need to honor Alina's sacrifice and make sure nothing like this happens again.
There were murmurs of agreement, but not everyone was convinced. Some villagers still looked uneasy, unsure of the weight of the truth they were being forced to confront. Henrik's voice rose with passion, his hands trembling slightly.
The mayor's lies have kept us from growing. They've made us afraid of our own neighbors. But we can be better. We owe it to Alina, and we owe it to ourselves to be better. We must ensure that we choose leaders who care about the truth, who care about justice, and who will never betray this village the way the mayor did.
There was a long silence as the villagers exchanged looks. The weight of the past was heavy on their shoulders, but Henrik's words had ignited something, a spark of hope, perhaps. They had lived in the shadows long enough. It was time to step into the light. Finally, one by one, the villagers stood up. They raised their hands in support, their faces marked with regret, but also with determination. They voted to preserve the letters, to honor Alina's courage, and to commit to a future where transparency and honesty would be the foundation of their community. Henrik's heart swelled with relief. The reckoning was painful, but necessary. The village had faced its past, and now together they could move forward. The shadows of fear no longer held them captive. The truth, though difficult, had set them free. Alina was reburied with a gravestone that read, "In memory of Alina, who sought justice for all." As her grave was filled, the wolves' howls faded, signaling peace had returned to the village. A memorial was placed in the village square, honoring Alina's courage and the truth she had uncovered. The villagers, now united, stood in silence, reflecting on their past mistakes but committed to change. Rachel's article brought the story to national attention, inspiring many with the village's transformation. Though scarred by their history, the villagers looked forward with hope, determined to rebuild and ensure the lessons of transparency and justice guided their future.